Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this special program. Today, we are pleased to welcome Jim Remar from the Cosmosphere as our guest speaker to talk a little bit about what Ike started when creating NASA. Let's get things started. So, Jim, I'll turn this over to you, but would you please start with telling us just a little bit about your background?
Sure. Jim Remar, President and CEO here at the Cosmosphere. I have been in the museum industry since 1997. Started out as executive director of the Mifflinburg Buggy Museum in Mifflinburg, Pennsylvania, site that preserved a horse-drawn vehicle manufacturing facility. Then in 2000, moved here to the Cosmosphere. I'm from Hutchinson, became curator. Been at the Cosmosphere for 17 and a half years. Was named CEO in 2018. Did not have one bit of understanding of space exploration when I started here. So early on, read everything I could, and today really enjoy early manned space exploration. So for those of you who haven't been to the Cosmosphere, we house the largest collection of U.S. artifacts outside of the Smithsonian and the largest collection of Soviet artifacts outside of Moscow, which puts us in the definitive position to tell the story of the space race. And we do that in a point-counterpoint basis. And yesterday had a big anniversary celebration, our own Liberty Bell 7 spacecraft. That mission was 60 years old yesterday, and so had a big celebration. But here today to talk about Eisenhower's role in developing NASA. A lot of people don't really understand the role the Eisenhower administration played in the development of the creation of NASA. So I think it's an incredibly important topic, and the development of NASA is something that obviously still resonates today as space exploration continues to go forward. But before NASA started, the first entity that had oversight of aeronautics in this country was the NACA, the National Advisory Council for Aeronautics. It was developed in 1915. Luminaries such as the Wright brothers were part of that initial group, and it was developed to determine or look at how the United States could develop aeronautics. Coming out of World War I, Europe had superior air power. And so the soldiers and generals that were over there saw this. And so the NACA was initially developed to look at creating superior air power. It continued to grow and develop in terms of its exploration and oversight of aeronautics. Some of the significant programs such as the X-15 were done under the auspices of the NACA. So the NACA was the precursor to NASA. So how do we get started? Well, it really started with the launch of Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. Sputnik was really the first shot across the bow. It was what led this country to recognize that there was a space race. If you could go to the next slide, Samantha. And the two individuals responsible during that period of time were Sergei Korolev, the chief designer on the Soviet side, and then Wernher von Braun, the chief designer on the US side. Korolev was the one who was intimately responsible for getting the Soviets up first. It wasn't until after his death that the world knew who Sergei Korolev was. The Soviets kept his identity closely guarded for fear of assassination. On the other hand, Wernher von Braun was widely known. In fact, he appeared many times with Walt Disney on various Disney shows. Von Braun immigrated to the United States. He was a former Nazi commander. He was responsible for the development of the V-2 during World War II, strategically surrendered to the United States, and then came to the United States to begin working on rockets that would ultimately get a human to moon. Next slide, please. So October 4th, 1957, that was the start of the space race. If you could go to the next slide. So prior to this, each country, the former Soviet Union and the United States, were working on their own individual programs. But when Sputnik went up and they scored that first, it was a huge blow to the American psyche and the American ideology. And right away, as soon as that launched, the race to the moon was on. It was a race between two countries, but it was a race between two countries that possessed different technology, but technology that would not only achieve space exploration firsts, but also was developed for military uses as well. Next slide. So initially, during the outset of the space race, Eisenhower had learned lessons during World War II, using propaganda and psychology to influence the Allies. He saw how effective psychological warfare, if you will, propaganda was at helping the Allies understand the successes. So Eisenhower quickly understood that utilizing propaganda and psychology would begin to influence the American psyche at home, as well as the psyche of those democracies across the country that were allies of the United States. It was understood that through propaganda and psychological warfare, if you will, that each country could allow its followers to understand what was happening, but more importantly, to influence. This was a space race, but it was also a race between two different political ideologies. You had the communists on one side, democracy on the other side, and both countries felt that through achieving firsts, through utilizing psychology and propaganda, they could potentially influence other countries, but more importantly, could show that their chosen form of government was superior. If Soviets achieved first, Khrushchev could use that to say that communism is superior over democracy. If U.S. achieves first, Eisenhower administration can utilize that to show that democracy is superior over communism. The 1957 launch of Sputnik was a huge blow to the American psyche. But one thing that didn't take place, that was false, was some thought at the time that the U.S. became instantly concerned of an attack from the Soviets. The Eisenhower administration knew that the Soviets possessed the engineering, the rocketry capable of reaching the United States, but didn't fear a larger nuclear attack because they knew the Soviets did not have the technology that would allow for pinpoint accuracy. So while a nuclear, an ICBM could potentially reach the United States, it would not have been an accurate attack. So the theory out there that the United States at that time was fearful of a large attack, was just not something that the Eisenhower administration believed. So the Soviets quickly score the second first. In November of 1957, the Soviets launched the first living creature into space with Laika the dog aboard the R-7 rocket. So they have now achieved two firsts: Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, and then Sputnik 2 places Laika into orbit, becoming the first living creature to go into orbit. And at this point in time, we haven't even gotten off the ground yet. So quickly out of the gate, within a matter of months, the Soviets achieved two quick victories. You can go to the next slide. At this point in time, while the Soviets are achieving firsts, there are competing programs here in the United States. there is competition between the Army and the Navy. Both branches of the military are working on their own space initiatives. Neither one are working in conjunction with the other. Both are independent, and they were both working to develop their own space program. The Navy was working on the Vanguard program. The Army was working on the Redstone program, and neither were doing so with the other. So the competing military branches was probably one of the primary factors to why the U.S. hadn't achieved firsts. From a technological and an engineering perspective, we possessed the ability to reach space as early as 1955. But because we had two branches competing against each other, there was no concerted effort. At this point in time, Eisenhower allowed both branches to continue to work on these boosters, the rockets that would ultimately get into space. He didn't see the need to bring in or to bring the agency underneath one public entity. Next slide. So our first attempt to launch a satellite was Vanguard. This was a Navy program, December 6, 1957. Shortly after the liftoff of Vanguard, as you can see in the images, the rocket exploded. The press had a field day with this, calling it Flopnik, Kaputnik, Stayputnik, obviously referencing the Sputnik achievements. So within 3 months, we suffer three embarrassments: Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, and then the explosion of Vanguard. So our track record is on shaky ground. Unfortunately, the U.S. is out of the blocks very slowly in the race to space. Next slide. So finally, the U.S. gets in the game. Explorer 1 becomes our first satellite to go up into space. This was overseen by Wernher von Braun, as well as JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Explorer was launched aboard a Jupiter rocket. After the failure of Vanguard, von Braun went to the Eisenhower administration and asked that the Redstone program be given a chance to prove their capabilities. Initially, the Eisenhower administration was reluctant, but because of the failure of Vanguard, allowed von Braun and his team to proceed. What the Eisenhower administration probably didn't realize at the time was that underneath the Army at the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, von Braun and his team of rocket scientists had been perfecting the Redstone rocket. Von Braun made some tweaks to the Redstone rocket and then changed its name to Jupiter. Then, utilizing the technology that had already been developed, 90 days after the launch of Vanguard, von Braun's Jupiter rocket with Explorer 1 lifts off. And one of the discoveries from the Explorer 1 satellite was the Van Allen radiation belts. And that's von Braun after the Explorer 1 success with President Eisenhower in Eisenhower's office. Go ahead to the next slide. So at this time, the Eisenhower administration begins to understand the need to create an agency that would have oversight for space exploration. A lot of people felt that the October 4th, 1957 launch of Sputnik was what led the Eisenhower administration to begin to think about creating an agency. But in fact, Eisenhower and his administration had been contemplating that prior to the launch of Sputnik. They knew that the Soviets possessed the capability, the technology to launch a satellite in space. They just didn't know when it was going to happen. And Eisenhower began to think about the merits of having an agency that oversaw the exploration of space. So in a joint address to Congress, April 2nd of 1958, Eisenhower talks about the importance of space exploration and the need for an agency to oversee the development of our rockets and the program in general. Next slide. So in July of 1958, both the Senate and the House passed a resolution creating a new federal entity. And on July 29th, 1958, Eisenhower signs into law the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So the former NACA is now folded into NASA. So NASA now is a public agency, a government agency that has oversight for aeronautics, but it also has oversight for the fledgling space program and is charged with the race to space. Next slide. So initially, NASA is set up in the old NACA headquarters out at Langley Field. So the NACA had been at Langley since the 1915s, and NASA began to operate from Langley. Next slide, please. So here's some of the images of the original NASA headquarters. So it was initially a space task group that had oversight for the space program. And shortly after Eisenhower signed into law the creation of NASA, NASA and the new agency got to work. So on October of 1958, the former NACA and then the new NASA merge, creating the Space Task Group, and began to look at how to get the US into the game and to catch up with the Russians. Next slide. So by 1959, NASA had developed Project Mercury. Project Mercury was going to be the program that got a US human into space. In April 9 of 1959, NASA introduces the Mercury 7, the original 7 astronauts that were going to be responsible for getting a capsule, piloting a capsule up into space and then returning it safely. Next slide. So initially, the Space Task Group was thinking that the original astronauts would need to be engineers, PhDs, people with an understanding of science and technology. Eisenhower realized that the initial astronauts needed to be pilots. More importantly, they needed to be military pilots. And so the initial astronauts were from several branches of the military, and many of them were test pilots. And these 7 were selected from a group of hundreds of applicants submitted their names to try and become one of the original 7. With each step, that group was narrowed down. They had to undergo tremendous testing, both physical, mental, as well as medical. And so all of this testing was done and taken place. They also looked at background, track record, piloting abilities. And when the original 7 were introduced, these 7 were the best of the best. Not only incredible pilots, but very intelligent with strong engineering minds. Next slide. So the original 7 were going to go up and pilot a Mercury. Now, the Mercury, unlike what we saw a couple days ago with the Blue Origin New Shepard, was a piloted spacecraft. It wasn't your traditional stick and rudder, but it did have a joystick, and it did have thrusters, reaction thrusters that were controlled by the astronauts. The astronauts were in pressure suits in case the internal environment depressurized. So the challenges of Mercury were to, one, try and determine what impact working in the vacuum of space, the environment of space, would have on the human body, determine how to operate in space, both human and spacecraft, and then to get a spacecraft and human into space and to return them both safely. And with one exception, the missions of Mercury performed flawlessly. The one exception was Liberty Bell 7, which upon splashdown, the hatch blew prematurely and the spacecraft sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, where it resided for 38 years. Again, these were the best, fearless. At this point in time, during the training for Project Mercury, our launch success rate was only 39%. So more times than not, the rockets on the launch pad were exploding. In fact, the last unmanned Mercury mission to take place prior to Alan Shepard going up was Mercury Atlas 1. This was done in 1960, and shortly after liftoff, the Atlas exploded. Yet only a few months later, Shepard went up on top of that redstone and became the first U.S. astronaut to reach space. Next slide. September 25th, 1959, Khrushchev visits the Eisenhower administration. He visits Washington and spends time with Eisenhower at Camp David. At this point in time, the Soviets have scored the firsts and are ahead in the space race, but not by much. But both Khrushchev and Eisenhower saw each other as rivals. This photo is of note because you'll see in Eisenhower's right hand a small sphere. That's called the lunosphere, and in fact is on display there at the Eisenhower Museum. Prior to getting humans into space, both countries sent unmanned lunar pathfinders to the moon. On Luna 2, the Soviets sent their lunar pathfinder with that same type of sphere that is in Eisenhower's hand, and they called it the lunar calling card. So the idea was that this unmanned pathfinder would shoot this ball towards the surface of the moon. The ball was spring-loaded and comprised of tiny medallions with the hammer and sickle and CCCP on it. The idea was if the U.S. were the first to land on the moon, they would see these lunar calling cards and think the Soviets had been there. There's only 3 of these lunospheres that I know of left. One obviously there at the Eisenhower Museum, one is here at the Cosmosphere, and then the third one is in Moscow. So a really cool artifact. Next slide, please. So even though an astronaut wasn't launched during the Eisenhower administration, the Eisenhower administration was responsible for the development of the Mercury program. That is obviously Eisenhower on the left, and then the first administrator of NASA, Dr. Keith Glennon, and that's a meeting in the Oval Office in 1960. And while it was the Kennedy administration that America would get a human into space, none of that would have been possible without the Eisenhower administration. So even going back to the mid-50s, when the Eisenhower administration began to think about a satellite program, they began to think about a space program, those wheels were set in motion. And while it was Kennedy who challenged this country to get to the moon by the end of the decade, he did that in May of 1961, that wouldn't have been possible if the foundation hadn't already been laid by the Eisenhower administration. Often when you hear about the space program or talk about the space program, President Kennedy is mentioned, President Johnson is mentioned, even to some degree President Nixon. But I will contend or contest that none of that would have been possible had it not been for Eisenhower, his administration, their foresight, the understanding of the importance of NASA, the understanding of the importance of the space race. Again, we're talking about a space race that is ideological, political, military, as well as technological. And with each step of the way, the U.S. is able to prove its superiority as long as it continues to grow. And all of that came from the Eisenhower administration. So with that, I will open it up for questions. There's a lot of that happened with the Eisenhower administration, and a lot of the early technology, the early agency development was made possible. People like Gene Kranz and Glenn Lunny, the original Mercury 7, luminaries in the history of space exploration, were all brought into NASA during Eisenhower's tenure in office.
start typing your questions in the chat. Well, while they're doing that, I did have a question.
Absolutely.
Just with your last statement, you were talking about how Eisenhower doesn't necessarily get that full recognition for his contributions. Why do you think that is?
Well, personally, I think it's twofold. One, because Kennedy laid down the gauntlet. He was the one responsible for challenging the country to get to the moon by the end of the decade, for humans to set foot on the moon by the end of the 60s. Also, human space exploration took place during the Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon administrations. So while astronauts and cosmonauts didn't go up into space during the Eisenhower administration, it wouldn't have been possible without what Eisenhower did and accomplished. And so I think those things overshadow the creation of NASA. At this time, we're into the Cold War, coming out of World War II and the Korean War. The U.S. possesses incredible technology. It was during this time that science, technology, engineering, and math become very important. In fact, many of the early engineers that would play prominent roles in the space program were in college studying engineering in the late 50s. People that I just mentioned, such as Gene Kranz, Glenn Lunny, Chris Kraft, the original seven, these were people who allowed Kennedy's challenge to be achieved, but they were also individuals who were brought into NASA at the outset back in the late 58 and early 59. And so again, if Eisenhower and his administration hadn't had the foresight to develop that and to really place an emphasis on space exploration, I don't think we achieved Kennedy's challenge by the end of the decade. But because we did, I think Eisenhower and his administration and accomplishments get overshadowed. So question, where did Soviet rockets touch down once they re-entered the Earth's atmosphere? Well, that's a great question. So the rockets themselves would have mostly burnt up upon re-entry, but the spacecraft came down in the plains of Kazakhstan. Our astronauts came down on water. So Mercury program landed in the Atlantic. Gemini, both Atlantic and Pacific. Apollo Pacific. Vostok and Voskhod and Soyuz to this day all land on terra firma. An interesting note, when Yuri Gagarin became the first human to go into space and to orbit the Earth, he did not land with his Vostok spacecraft. Prior to the spacecraft touching down, Gagarin ejected, came down in a parachute away from his spacecraft. But Vostok hit like a cannonball. It hit with such force that it dug a hole, a big crater in the Earth. And there's a great picture of the Vostok after it landed. It came down and the wind caught the parachute. And when that wind caught the chute, it drug the Vostok, creating a large trench in the fields of Kazakhstan.
I asked a question that asked, was the Soviet Space Agency an overtly military operation, or was it a civilian agency like NASA?
That's a great question. So let me talk about NASA first. Because Eisenhower had the foresight to create NASA, automatically, instantly, all of our resources, technology, engineering, brilliant minds, were now underneath one umbrella. And so that means all the funding necessary, all the resources necessary, were working towards one objective. And while von Braun was a brilliant engineer and his team responsible for developing the Saturn V, the booster that got us to the moon, there were many other brilliant engineers that were working for NASA. And it was the collective resources of all these individuals working together that allowed us to achieve our objective. In fact, at the height of Apollo, there were over 20,000 contractors, over 400,000 employees, all working towards one goal. The same was not said in the former Soviet Union. At that time, in the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union didn't have one entity responsible for space exploration. In fact, military, more than the public, was driving a lot of that. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, who was responsible for those initial Soviet firsts, was competing against many different engineers and scientists. And none of these were working together collectively. In fact, most were working against the other. Sergei literally had other Soviet engineers and scientists who were trying to one-up him. Even though he is leading the charge of Soviet firsts, his so-called colleagues were trying to stab him in the back, for lack of a better word. And many contend that when Korolev died in 1966, so too did the Soviets' ability or opportunity to reach the moon. So it was a much different environment in the former Soviet Union than it was here in the United States.
All right, we have a question/comment from Nicole. Says, I think Ike sent a message up on an early satellite for broadcast. Was it the first satellite message?
It was the first U.S. satellite message, and it was done after Explorer. Sputnik was really the first so-called message, Sputnik 1. While it wasn't broadcast, it did emit beeps. So those beeps were audible by ham radio operators around the world.
And I believe we have that message. And I think Samantha has it queued up, or maybe not. Maybe she's just showing it.
Remarks of the President that were used in a satellite and transmitted back to Earth. The President's Office in the White House, December 17th, 1958.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space. My message is a simple one. Through this unique means, I convey to you and to all mankind America's wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere.
That's so cool.
Very cool.
Thank you for that question, Nicole, because that's super cool. I'm excited. All right, we have a new question. President Eisenhower was committed to keeping the International Geophysical Year activities and the pursuit of satellites as scientific and not military endeavors. What role do you think this played in the selection of the Navy's Vanguard program over the Army's Redstone program led by von Braun and many ex-Nazi scientists? Did his work
that's a great question. I think it played a definite role. The Army Redstone program was viewed as a military program. At that time, the Redstone was this country's ICBM, and Eisenhower was very cognizant of that, and as you state, wanted to try and keep the military out of it. The Vanguard program, on the other hand, while it was a Navy program, was not a military program. The Vanguard rocket was never going to be an ICBM. It was being developed purely to try and get a satellite up into space. So I think that absolutely played an instrumental role in Eisenhower's decision. A really great question regarding the Nazis. I've often wondered that myself. I don't have any data that indicates one way or the other whether Eisenhower had issues dealing with von Braun and some of his ex-Nazi scientists. But I can't help but think about what that must have felt like for Eisenhower. Here was the supreme commander of the Allied forces, obviously understood and knew and saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis. So I would imagine that Eisenhower probably had some difficulty in dealing with the ex-Nazis, but that's purely an assumption on my part. I've never read anything that would indicate one way or the other, but given what Eisenhower knew and saw, one would think that was likely.
Jack asked, how did the Cosmosphere come to be in Hutchinson, Kansas?
That's a great question. So we started out in 1962 as a small planetarium. Our founder, a woman by the name of Patty Carey, had a love of the stars. And in fact, her uncle was Edwin Hubble, who the Hubble telescope is named after, early astronomer. Patty wanted to share her love of astronomy and the stars with the community. And so she raised the funds to purchase a used star projector and a dome, and they set up in the Pulcher building on the state fairgrounds. In 1966, Hutchinson Community College invited Patty's planetarium to come onto their campus. So in 66, we moved here to our present location. And then by the mid 70s, with the end of Apollo, Patty wanted to create a science education center. And there were centers on the coasts in major metropolitan areas, but there wasn't anything servicing this area. And so Patty said, why not? When she was asked why Hutch, and her response would be, well, why not? And so Patty set the wheels in motion to create a science education center. In 1980, the Kansas Cosmosphere and Discovery Center opened here on the campus. And then we've grown from that point on. Back in the late 70s, NASA and the Smithsonian were working to determine how to dispose of all the hardware from the early manned space program. As I had said earlier, over 20,000 contractors across the United States working on the space program. And so literally there are warehouses all over that had hardware. And all of that belonged to NASA. By law, Smithsonian has right of first refusal. So anything that NASA would dispose of or excess out of their property would be offered to Smithsonian first. Overnight, NASA had 3,000 to 4,000 objects that it was wanting to dispose of. Smithsonian turned those down and agreed that those objects could come to the Cosmosphere here in Hutchinson. And so literally within, a day, we went from having no collection to one of the larger collections. And then we've just built our collection up and have expanded our facility over time to create what we have today.
Wow, it's very interesting.
I will say that, 2 days ago, we saw Blue Origin go up into space aboard the New Shepard. I think we're at a similar spot today as we were back in the late 50s and early 60s when Eisenhower and his administration began to place an emphasis on getting humans into space. We're doing exactly what the Mercury project did 60 years ago. Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic a couple weeks ago basically replicated what Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom did. They did suborbital flights. They got up into space. They came back safely. And I think we're at the dawn of a new era of space exploration. Space exploration is cool again. It's in the media. SpaceX obviously has already demonstrated their ability to get not only a capsule but crew up into space. And so I think we're going to see a new partnership between the agency Eisenhower created, that being NASA, and then the private sector. NASA doesn't have the budget that it once did. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong touched down on the surface of the moon, NASA's budget was about $25 billion. That represented maybe 4 or 5% of the total federal budget. Today, NASA's budget is about $15 billion and doesn't even register 1% of the current federal budget. And so NASA is going to need the private sector to come alongside it to continue to achieve its goals and to continue to move exploration of space forward. It's an exciting opportunity, and I think some of the brightest days are in front of us.
Don, I see your hand up.
David typed his comment first, so let's go ahead and do mine next.
I missed it. I apologize.
That's a great question, David. I don't have a lot of knowledge about the Corona program, other than it was an early unmanned planetary pathfinder, a pretty majestic satellite. So I apologize. I don't know a lot about the Corona program. Maybe somebody else on here has more knowledge of Corona.
All right, well, I'll ask my question then. What is there a connection, or what is the connection between that original push for STEM education and what we're experiencing now? Is there a connection at all?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. There is. Back during the Eisenhower administration, and then even into the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, but it started with Eisenhower. There was a huge push for STEM education. We, again, coming out of the war, there were a lot of technological advances, but I think Eisenhower and his administration also understood the need to continue to push that envelope. So there was a huge emphasis on engineering, both from a military perspective, but also from a space exploration perspective. The Cold War was raging, the space race was on, and so there was a huge push to continue to keep the U.S. at the forefront of technology. At some point, that was de-emphasized. I'm not sure at what point or what period we as a country began to place less emphasis on STEM and on the STEM education. But that has since become a new point of emphasis. It's something we promote here, and I'm sure you talk about it there at the Eisenhower. We talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, but we don't care necessarily if a student has an interest in becoming an engineer, becoming a mathematician, becoming a scientist. We just want to create that spark, ignite a passion. And if that student wants to go run a CNC router or a welder or work in the trades, that's awesome, because that's necessary. And let's not forget, out of those over 400,000 individuals who were working on Project Apollo, the 3 astronauts at the top of the rocket were the ones who got all the notoriety and the fame. But there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of individuals who put those rockets together, who welded those rockets, who put those rivets in, who wired the harnesses. And I think that's something that was important during the Eisenhower administration, is you had people willing to understand STEM, but then apply it in something that maybe wasn't necessarily a 4-year degree. I think we're finally starting to see that approach again, whereas yes, STEM is important, 4-year degree is absolutely important, but let's not forget about the other things that are necessary. My son's a primary example. He's mechanically inclined and loves using his hands. Well, he's going to school to become a combine mechanic, a John Deere combine mechanic. Well, let me tell you, he absolutely has to understand science, technology, and engineering and math, because that's absolutely a part of it. But it's a 2-year degree where he'll use his hands, but he's utilizing that for a valuable service to this country's farmers. So I'm glad to see the direction we're going. Unfortunately, we lost our way for a period of time, but I think we're getting back. And again, that started with the Eisenhower administration.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I have a funny question. You said that the Vostok landing created this giant crater.
Yes.
And now every time you see a movie about like space or something falling from space or a superhero dive, straight diving down to Earth from space, it leaves this giant crater.
Right.
Is that what inspired it? Or
I would say, probably in some parts. I mean, it's interesting to sort of follow pop culture as it relates specifically to space. And you go back to Jules Verne, and then continue along. And pop culture has taken a lot of what it has done from what has happened in space. And space has taken some of what it has done from pop culture. So it's kind of neat to see the tie between the two. So I would say that that's probably a direct result of those early spacecraft coming down and leaving a very large crater.
it's funny to see that. Now, when you said it, I thought, I wonder if that's what's happening or what happened. I guess I have one other question. How do you feel about, I know you said that NASA will be forced to work with the private sector for space exploration, but how do you feel about regular citizens who are not, well trained going into space?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm all for anything space, because if space is in the public eye or in the media, Cosmosphere benefits directly. It allows people to get excited about space, and hopefully they'll come here to learn more. I'm more about space, the exploration of space, the advances that come from space. A lot of what we use in our daily lives was developed for a reason related specifically to the exploration of space. Hundreds of thousands of products we use daily in our lives come directly from space exploration. I think it's important that we continue to explore. This world was developed based on exploration. By nature, we are explorers. I'm less about the tourism side of it. Maybe I'm more of a traditionalist or a purist, but I think just because you ride an automated rocket and spacecraft past a certain point in space, you get your astronaut wings. Those individuals really didn't do anything related to what a traditional astronaut or cosmonaut does. Those individuals aren't necessarily contributing to exploration or advances in technology. They're basically purchasing a seat on a booster in a spacecraft, much like we do when we are flying an airplane. Just because I flew in an airplane from point A to point B, I don't automatically get my pilot's wings. But these people get their astronaut wings. And so while it's kind of a cute stunt, I'm not a huge proponent of the tourism side as I am the exploration and technological advances.
Don would like for you to tell us about your exhibit fabrication portion of the business.
Sure. So we operate a division of the Cosmosphere called SpaceWorks. SpaceWorks produces exhibitry, not only for ourselves, but for entities all over the world. We do restoration of artifacts, and we fabricate replicas. So some of our restoration projects, we restored the Apollo 13 Command Module Odyssey, obviously the Liberty Bell 7. 7-8 years ago, Jeff Bezos with Bezos Expeditions funded an expedition to recover the F-1 rocket engines from the Saturn V. He contracted with us to do the conservation. We did the mission control consoles down at NASA Johnson Space Center, Historic Mission Operations Control. Some of our fabrication projects, we did most of the set props and hardware for the movie Apollo 13. We worked on From the Earth to the Moon. We've worked on multiple productions for Tom Hanks, such as Magnificent Desolation, From the Earth to the Moon. We did First Man. We've done exhibitry work for groups all over the world. We built a UFO of all things for a museum in Taiwan. Our team actually just traveled to DC last week. They built the display frame, exhibit frame for the Apollo 11 command module. So they went out there to install it. So our team is one of the foremost experts at restoration, built up an expertise on fabricating replicas and then doing exhibit work. It's a division of ours, but it's one that does generate revenue for the operation. Yeah, Kansas proud. We absolutely.
I'm gonna have to come visit. That sounds so cool.
Yeah, it is. In fact, our guys are getting ready to leave in 3 weeks, I believe. They're going to go to Brazil, Sao Paulo, Brazil. They're setting up an exhibit down there that we're supporting. And then sometime this fall, they'll go to Warsaw, Poland. There's another touring exhibition that we support. And then we're talking with a group about doing a project in Bangkok in 2022.
Awesome. Sounds very interesting. Make you excited to come to work every day.
Yeah, it does. It makes it easy.
Well, Nicole has just made the comment that the Cosmosphere is a must-see destination, and she is very glad that it's in Kansas. If you have not been, you definitely should go. I'm on that list of not have been, so I will put it on my calendar. And thank you so much, Jim. If we don't have any other questions, then we will close out the program, so just give us a second. Right. Today's program is sponsored by the Eisenhower Foundation with generous support from the Jeffcoat Foundation. Our next program is our August Evenings at Ease on Tuesday, August 10th at 7 p.m. Central. We are going to learn more about People to People International as we host Merrill Atwater, who is President Eisenhower's grandson and CEO of the organization. You can visit our website at eisenhowerlibrary.gov to learn more about our upcoming programs. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next program.